Hey everyone, I want to welcome you to our second conversation in our teaching series, Start Again. Our goal and purpose for having these conversations is to understand that peace, that part, that relationship thing we get to have with God in which He wants to do things in our lives that will mean starting afresh. It will mean stopping some things and starting some things, and He has a plan and a desire to see those things happen in our lives. And we know that there are moments, places, there are relationships, there are things in our lives, if we just could, we would love to hit the reset button. We would love to start again. We would love to have a fresh start and maybe do them differently. And so that's why we're having these conversations. What we get to talk about is what it's like to actually be done with the old and to start the new. And our core text for our teaching series comes from 2 Corinthians. It says that what it means to anyone who belongs to Christ is that they've become a new person, that the old life is gone and that the new life has begun. To understand this, we have to understand that not every idea that we have of how we want things to be, how every time we would start it again is how it should be, but we need to actually understand how God would have it be. There are times in our lives in which we've tried to restart things, like we've tried to shuffle things up, we've tried to refresh, and it just didn't go how we wanted it to go. And I think a lot of that is connected to that truth that sometimes we don't actually want what God wants, and God's not actually going to allow us to continue to go in a direction He doesn't want us to go. That's why some of our restarts feel more like false starts, and we haven't actually been able to do what we're supposed to do or we actually even want to do. So as we walk through this conversation, that's what I want you to be thinking about, is how in my life have I tried to start, but it didn't really take? And maybe was it because God had a different kind of start for you to take? And so we have started as conversations in our first conversation that if you missed that, you can find that on our YouTube channel. You can track along with us because one of them really does build upon the rest for context. What we're seeking to do is understand our restarts in our lives from a moment in history and in which I think God made the biggest kind of first obvious big fresh start for His people. Everything from it is a foreshadowing of the greatest restart that He would do, the greatest rescue and the greatest redemption. What we're doing is we're looking at the exodus of God's people from the country of Egypt. Because what happened to the people, God's people, is they moved to Egypt and they lived there and they had some people in authority, and so they were thought of well, and over time things changed and governments changed and rulers changed and their social standing went down, down, down. Eventually, after a few centuries, they find themselves in slavery. They're in absolute bondage. They're the bottom of the ladder, and they're treated so poorly, so harshly, that they cry out to God seeking rescue and relief. And this is kind of where we pick things up of what God then does to start rolling forward, rolling out His rescue plan for His people. In Exodus 6, this is what God says to Moses. Moses, His messenger of rescue. He says, give this message to the people of what I'm about to do. In chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, He says, therefore, say to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will free you from your oppression, and I will rescue you from your slavery in Egypt. I will redeem you with a powerful arm and great acts of judgment. I will claim you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from the oppression in Egypt. I will bring you into a land I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as your very own possession. I am the Lord. Now, if you were a people group, or even if you were just an individual and you've been crying out and calling out to God, we need rescue, we need change, wouldn't this be exactly what you wanted to hear? Someone comes along and says, hey, here's the promise of God. Here's exactly what He's going to do. He's going to bring freedom. He's going to bring restitution. He's going to give you your own land. He's going to make you a great nation. He's going to do all of these things. Wouldn't you think that your first response would be, yes, let's do this. The wheels are rolling. It's rolling out. But what we see in God's people is, I think, oftentimes what we feel, even if we don't maybe express it as garishly as they do. The very next verse, chapter 6, verse 9, Moses told the people of Israel what the Lord had said, but they refused to listen anymore. They had become too discouraged by the brutality of their slavery. Now, one thing I want to make sure that we don't do, which we do far too often as human beings, is we see other people's situations and the decisions they make or the things that they say, and we like to pass judgment. Like, take for example the Olympics and Simone Biles. A lot of people got a lot of opinions what she should and should not do, and if you've not heard about that, you can read up on it and see how human beings tend to react when they don't fully understand something, but they like to impose on the situation kind of what they think that they would do. Now, this is kind of a similar situation with Israel. If we're not careful, we read God's word and we look at people who maybe don't react the best way, respond the best way, and we're like, well, I would do better. I want you to understand how the Israelites were viewing their lives at that point. A few centuries in slavery, bottom of the barrel, they've called out to God, we want things to change. And if we're not careful, we'll impose upon them that they should just do everything right the first time. Like everything that they do should be this beautiful, godly response. But as with the Israelites, as it is with us, we don't pursue God. We don't trust God, love God in a vacuum. It's not like we get to put everything on hold, family, business, work, money, politics. We put all that to one side and we just focus on God. That's not what we live in. We live in this continually broken world that it isn't that good, and things happen that continue to discourage us from what God would actually have us do. That is the difficulty in which these people are facing. There is no single human being on earth that hasn't at some point, after seeking out God, after crying out to Him, having wanting to restart, in which they've just realized it's not going how they want it to go. Like it's not starting, it's not refreshing, it's not restoring in the way that they would personally desire it to. And every single one of us at one point in our minds, or even vocally cry out, God, what are you doing? What are you doing? And how does what you're doing fit in with what I asked you to do? Too much of our problem is that we seek things, we desire things to play out in a certain way, and then they don't. And we can jump to thinking that God doesn't love us, that God doesn't desire good things for us, rather than entertaining that maybe God actually wants it to play out differently. Now, this can be in your original pursuit of God, like you're just starting out and you think it should be different, things should change, or maybe you're dealing with a consistent, persistent sin that you're trying to tackle. Maybe it's a trial, maybe it's even a blessing, maybe it's even like a goal and ambition that you're desiring to see things move in, and it's just not playing out that way. All of us can say, honestly, every single one of us that has believed and has followed, everyone can say that at one time or another, this doesn't seem to connect. These things seem to be disparate. And it's like that for the people in Egypt. It's exactly like that for them, that things that are supposed to be changing for their good, for their benefit, don't seem to be going that way. Yet, what we need to come back to is the unassailable truth that God knows what is best. And if we do not desire His way of restarting things, redoing things, then we will feel like those requests go unfilled over and over again, and they can lead to frustration, they can lead to distrust, they can lead to disbelief. To understand the context of what God's people are sitting in, take a look at what's happened just before. Before Moses and Aaron come to them and say, "This is what God's going to do," they actually go to Pharaoh and they tell him what God's going to do. And we see what happens to the people of God in it. In Exodus chapter 5, it says, Pharaoh replied to Moses and Aaron after the great big presentation, "Why are you distracting the people from their tasks? Get back to work. Look, there are many of your people in the land, and you are stopping them from their work." The same day, Pharaoh sent an order to the Egyptian slave drivers and the Israelite foremen, "Do not supply any more straw for making bricks. Make the people get it themselves, but still require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce their quota. They're lazy." That's why they're crying out, "Let us go into the wilderness and make sacrifices to our God." Load them down with more work. Make them sweat. This will teach them to listen to lies. Now, in this instance, we see Pharaoh very much as the enemy of God's people. That's the role that he plays in God's historical account of Egypt and of Israel. He's the enemy of what God wants to do. And so he actually does everything to discourage these people from even believing in the plan. I mean, look what he actually says to them. He says right in there is, "Why are you distracting them from tasks and the work and the requirement that I've got of them?" They need to focus on what's in front of them. They need to focus on the jobs of this life And so if they're not going to do that, load them down even more. Make them sweat, crush them under so much life that they forget about what the actual purpose of life is. Now that's what happens. That's what happens when we seek to do anything that is good for our souls, good for us spiritually, good in a relationship with God. But it's not Pharaoh in our lives that's making that happen. Instead, what we have is a very tangible, very well explained enemy of our souls, the devil. The devil desires nothing more than to remove the relationship between God and his people. And so he does. He does things, says things, communicates things to us that make us want to be discouraged, make us want to drop it all down. See, if we don't understand what the enemy of our souls wants to do, if we don't take account for the work that he does in our lives, then we won't put into account the work that we need to do to keep him at bay. Because our enemy doesn't jump out from behind a tree with a pitchfork and pointy ears. Our enemy instead says the same kind of things that Pharaoh says to try and remove our focus from our God. Think about it. How many times in our lives have we tried to enact change? We've wanted to start again. We've applied ourselves for a little while, but then there are just too many tasks that need to get done. There are so many things that we have to go and work at instead of that. And there are so many requirements of our lives that we feel so laden down, we feel so overworked that we can't actually focus on this thing with God. I believe that if you looked at where we've struggled to change over our lives, where we've struggled to restart, it's got a lot less to do with what God was doing and a lot more to do with the fact that we got crushed by life and so didn't allow the change or didn't enact and didn't walk in the change that God had for us. Too often you hear the voice in your head. You have things you need to get done. You have people that you need to serve. You have money to earn. You have things to tidy and fold and clean. You have a job to go to. You have vacations to plan. You have family to take care of. You have to make sure that everything's okay. You have to work politically. You have to work socially. You have requirements. And after a while, and you put it all together, what's happening is life is just being loaded on you more and more and more, to the point that if we're not careful, we sweat out our decades here on earth. We work and we work and we work and we never walk in the plan that God has for us because life gets in the way of the purpose of life. And that's where we see the people. That's where we see the people so laden down by life, so laden down by Pharaoh, so laden down by the devil, that when someone comes along with the good news, oftentimes our response is, why are you making life harder for us? In Exodus 5, they said, as Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's court, they confronted them and said, what do you think you're doing? May the Lord judge you and punish you for making us stink before Pharaoh and his officials. You have put a sword in their hands, an excuse to kill us. This is why the why of our restart, the why of our change is so essential. The problem that the people of Israel had is that they had a plan in mind for how they were going to change things. They were going to cozy up to Pharaoh. They were going to be seen in Pharaoh's eyes as somehow better, and so therefore maybe be elevated in the future. That's their main argument. Why have you made us stink in front of Pharaoh and the officials, giving them excuse to get rid of us? We've been working super hard on building our reputation and building our relationship with them. Too much of our why for change and restart is just to make things better in Egypt. It's to make things a little bit better in Egypt. The problem with that is if we want God behind us in our change and our restarts, God doesn't desire to make life in Egypt a little bit better. He desires to give a brand new life. These people, they wanted Egypt to be their home. They had no intentions of leaving. They just wanted Egypt to be a bit more enjoyable. And the reason that things seem to disconnect and not be what they were asking God for is that that's not what he wants. He has a grander design that has nothing to do with making life in Egypt or life here for us just a little bit better. And as they assumed that that's what his plan would be, his actual plan looks ridiculous through their eyes. Very often we approach God, or God approaches us with his actual plan the desire he has, and it gets dismissed. We turn our noses up at it. We taunt it even because it doesn't really fit with what we would want. Because God's good news for the Israelites was not going to be some temporary fix. It was not going to make it a little bit better. It was not so they could enjoy more of Egypt. It was not what they thought it would be. Now I know oftentimes when people hear about Jesus Christ, the good news of Jesus Christ, his plan of redemption and rescue, the exact same thing happens. As we turn our noses up at it, because it doesn't really seem to be promising the things that we think that we actually want. It's not to make this life a little bit better. It's not a temporary band-aid fix. It's not to enjoy more of this world. It's not what we think it is. See, what God desires to do in our lives is to remove slavery, to remove bondage, to experience some freedom here, but in essence, all of it is about our eternity. See, God does not take all of the things from us that we would have him take, all of the difficulties and all of the trials. Instead, what he does is he changes who we are and how we approach these things and how we deal with them. Because if he took all of the things away, we would honestly think that this life was the best thing possible. If he made Egypt just a little bit more enjoyable, and Egypt 2.0, we'd become focused on it. Egypt with a bit more money in your pocket. Egypt with the president that you voted for. Or Egypt with the family you want, the girl you want, the boy you want. Egypt with the job you want, with the toys you want, with the retirement you want, the vacation you want. As soon as he would do that, we would only focus on that. And that's why he doesn't. If all we want is God to change things the way we want him to change them, we will never restart. You will never be able to start again. Instead, we need to see what he's doing above and beyond what we might consider or think. God's plan was not to better Egypt. It was to promise a promised land. A people that could experience something they've never had before. Complete freedom. An understanding of an intimate one-on-one in his presence, constantly relationship with him. That was his purpose, and that is how he seeks to make our lives change and shift into a permanent expression of love with him in this life and in the next. What God did in Exodus to cement this promise is he brought about plagues and a Passover to make sure that people understood what this life was and what the next life was promised to be. In Exodus 3:19-20, God actually says what he's going to do to make sure this happens. He says, I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand forces him, so I will raise my hand and strike the Egyptians, performing all kinds of miracles among them. Then at last he will let you go. See, what God does is he brings forth plagues, not blessings, plagues, to help people see what is most important, to see his plan. What he does is he systematically walks through all the things that we could find our lasting peace in, that we could hope to depend on, that we could worship. And he says, that is not what life is about. Life is about your relationship with me. And if you look at the plagues of Egypt, God is very systematic. First, he takes their water. Then he goes on to attack both their meat and dairy animals. And then their crops. He takes their food. He then fills the skies with gnats and flies so we can't even sit in peace. He goes on to remove that allure of physical beauty that we get so enamored with by covering everyone in boils. He then does some things to attack and damage buildings and gardens and everything that's been built and created. He takes away the weather. He takes away the sky. He takes away light. He takes everything from them so that they would know that life is not about here. And then he finally takes culturally the most significant, most important thing to the people, culturally in Egypt and for the Hebrews and for the Israelites. He takes away first sons. He takes away firstborn sons, the ones that families place most of their pride and joy in. He takes family to make the point, to cement his promise that it's not about here and it's not about now. And so what we have here is God doing these things so that the people would know that it's not about now. And in that very last moment when he takes away firstborn sons from the Egyptians, he gives the Israelites, his people, Passover. Now Passover, the first Passover, is celebrated by people today, and it's celebrated by us as Christians to a fashion and to a degree, because Passover was a foreshadowing of an even greater rescue he would do. A greater rescue from slavery, a greater rescue from sin, a greater rescue from everything that would seek to tear us away from him. The original Passover, God said, of all the sins that you've committed, desiring not my plan but your own, doing not your thing, not my thing but your thing, he says a sacrifice needs to be made because every sin leads to death. And I want you to understand that. And so every single household had to take a lamb, to take its blood and to spread it over the doorway of their home so that God could see that they had chosen him. It was their declaration that we are separate from Egypt. We are not them. We are yours. We're going to be yours. We're going to have this agreement, this covenant, this relationship. And so we're going to spread this blood on the walls. And Passover, to make sure that they understood that this was a fresh start, a new beginning, God actually said to them, hey, and from now on, this month in which you celebrate Passover is now the first month of your year. He even changed their entire calendar around so they would understand the significance of this restart. God did this for them and for us so we would understand for all time that all sin requires a punishment. It requires death because sin is the choice to walk away from the one who gives life. And if we want to choose him to start again, then we have to choose not Egypt, but to belong to him. And so what God did is he gave a sacrifice one for all time. He sent Jesus Christ so that we could choose and say, we want our home, we want us, we want me, I to be separated from Egypt. And we take that by understanding that his blood was shed for us, spread over his people so that they could choose rescue and salvation with him. And so we get to choose. That's the beautiful thing about God and about all of his work with mankind all through eternity is he lays forth choices. We get to choose who we're going to belong to, where we want to live, and where our eternity is going to be. First of all, we get to choose, do we want to live in Egypt? Because if we want to live in Egypt, we're going to find consistently that this life that we live is unsatisfied, unfulfilled. We can make it nice. We can distract ourselves. We can even try and improve our reputation with our slave driver. But in the end, it's going to be a life of slavery. It's going to be a life of oppression and subjugation, and it's going to end in that being perpetuated for eternity. God wants you to know that this life you're living right now is not the point. The point is to find salvation for our eternity. And if we do not focus, we'll find ourselves drifting, getting dragged into wanting to love Egypt again. We all do. At different times or another, we wake up and think this life is the purpose and point. We spend our time, spend our money, move our family, do all these things that actually look like we're just trying to make Egypt a little bit nicer for us to enjoy, rather than focusing on eternity and focusing on heaven. So that's your first choice, is to choose Egypt. And you can, and some do, and some will. Or we can choose God's plan, which is the promised land. We can choose God's plan, which is heaven, which is out of slavery and bondage to sin, out of the devil's domain, and an eternity with him. To make sure this promise was cemented in the Israelites in Egypt, he gave plagues and Passovers. For us, he sent Jesus Christ. The whole intent of Jesus Christ coming to this earth was that he would die for our sins so that we could choose to make him our sacrifice. We could choose to say we belong to you, God, based on what Jesus has done, on the understanding and belief I have that I have sinned, I need forgiveness, something needs to be sacrificed, and I trust Jesus to be that for me. And so now I will live in a life that honors that and honors your plan. That's what it looks like to choose him. To choose to have his blood shed over our homes and over our lives. To no longer associate ourselves with Egypt. This offer is for all of us. This offer that God would have us walk out. And then again, when we see Egypt creeping and chasing, we see sin chasing, we see the old life chasing, to start again every day and say, that's not who I belong to. That's not why I'm here. That's not what I'm going to do. And instead to trust God when he says, my plan for you is far greater than you would even have it be. So trust me that it's not about temporary fixes. It's not about even the absolute enjoyment of this world. It's about an eternal relationship with me. That's what our core text means. That's what 2 Corinthians means when it says anyone who belongs to Christ is a new person. The old is gone and the new life has begun. I encourage you today to choose where you're going to live your rest of your days here on earth and where you're going to live out your eternity. In an Egypt you seek to make better, or in a promised land that is perfect. Choose today. Have a conversation with someone here at Epiphany Station. Hit someone up in the chat. Take a snap of the QR code. Grab a real person in person if you're there at Epiphany. And talk to someone today. If you don't fully understand, or you think you want to make a move in what it means to have a relationship with Jesus Christ through this, or maybe to start again. Maybe it was something you once decided, but you've noticed, I'm just living in Egypt again. My family's in Egypt again. How do I come out again? We would love nothing more than to have that conversation with you, because you get to choose to start again.